So taking a step back in terms of this administration's approach on trade, I think what the markets got wrong is that they sort of erroneously thought that what President Trump was saying on the campaign trail leading up to the election 2016 was simply rhetoric, simply a way to get votes in kind of the Rust Belt states that have been hard hit by international trade. What I think people really missed is that this is maybe the only public policy issue, but at least the primary public policy issue that has animated this president for really his entire public life. He has been talking about trade since the 1980s when he was complaining about Japan taking advantage of the United States. He took out a full page ad against NAFTA in the early 1990s in the New York Times, and he was a very vocal opponent of China's accession to the WTO. So I think what people missed here is that this has been a fundamental view for this president, that he believes the United States is getting shortchanged on trade. You add to that the fact that he has advisors who share his worldview, Bob Lighthizer, his U.S. Trade Representative, Peter Navarro, one of his advisors, and the fact that the executive branch has really wide discretion over trade policy. He has ability to impose tariffs, to withdraw from the WTO, to withdraw from trade agreements, and all of that kind of sums up to this fact that trade policy and trade policy risk was going to be a risk for the markets going back to late 2017, and of course that's what we've seen. So fast forward to today, we see 25% tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods, 10% tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods, and now, of course, a deadline for a deal with China in order to avoid that 10% from increasing to 25%. I think there is this tension in the White House between the sort of so-called free traders and those advisors I mentioned before. And I think even President Trump struggles with this. In some ways, he needs a political victory. The government shutdown showed that he was weaker than I think many people thought. So he needs something that he can point to as a success. And a small deal with China certainly would be an example of that. On the other hand, he is, I think, rightfully so, worried that Speaker Pelosi sort of embarrassed him in this negotiation, that she won and he lost. And I think he will be very reticent to let the perception of the Chinese do the very same thing. So it's sort of this tension of trying to get a political win while also not trying to give the perception that the Chinese are taking advantage and continue to take advantage of the United States. So what does that mean? Liu He, the economic advisor to Xi Jinping, is over in Washington. I think that the sort of outcome of those meetings will be very important. And I think that our base case continues to be that we won't necessarily see an escalation between the Chinese and the U.S., but we also won't see a complete withdrawal of the tariffs. So our expectation is the tariffs are remain in place for the foreseeable future. Maybe there's a small trade deficit deal as a down payment, but that the deadline for a bigger structural deal is pushed out a few months. And that benefits China, of course, but also benefits President Trump because, again, it gives him a little bit of a political victory while also keeping the issues with China on the front burner simmering, if you will, as we enter into 2020.